In this short video, let's take a look at Sprint in Agile methodology. My name is Progan and welcome to .NET Mastery. Sprint is a very common word in racing. It basically means running at your top speed but for a short distance. And from there we basically pick some keywords and apply them in software development. So in Agile, Sprint is a short amount of time a team has to complete predefined amount of work. Before I go in depth in what a sprint is, it makes sense to understand what the traditional life cycle in a software development looked like. In the good old days, we used to have something called as Waterfall methodology. Let me spend a couple of minutes to explain what that is. In any software development, first we have to gather the requirements, then implementation comes into picture, after that we have testing, and finally we deploy the project. So it goes in a particular cycle that we have right here. But what happened in waterfall methodology is if you have a big project, initially all the requirements were gathered together, only after that implementation started, and after all the implementation is done, then testing was done on the complete project, and finally there was a deployment of the complete project. That is great, but with that we had many issues. Let's say after all the requirements were gathered in the implementation phase, if there were some requirement changes that were analyzed as the code was being built. So then we will fall back on the requirements again, and then the implementation would start again. That is still okay. But what if after all the implementation was done, during testing, some issues were found, and it was thought that the requirements that we had were not valid, so we will have to implement majority of the project again? That would be a big issue. And now think about this. Once the website is deployed and the business gives some feedback, then we have to work all the way around with the requirements if the business is not happy with the product and they thought these were not meant in the original requirements. There was some confusion for some reason. So in that case, since we deliver only one product at the end with one release, they had no idea about some of the basic requirements, and that is why business will say this is not the requirement we wanted. They will fall back on the requirement and the complete cycle starts again. That is such a big mess. I have personally seen some of the issues with waterfall methodology back in the old days. Let me show you one more example here. Let's say our requirement is taking some amount of time here. After the requirements are done, then implementation would start, then testing would start, and deployment after that. These are just the basic timelines that you see. Now let's say after the implementation was done, they found some issues with the requirement, so then they will fall back on the requirement, and once that requirement is done, then implementation on that new requirement would be done, testing and deployment. That would delay every step as you can see here. But on top of that, what will happen basically is only after the implementation was done, the issues were found. That is why if implementation takes a couple of months, then only after that they found the issues and requirements, all of them will start over again. Something even terrible is, let's say when the code is deployed, then they found issues with the requirement, so requirement will be planned again, implementation will be done again, testing will be done again, and deployment will be done again. One major flaw that we had here is at a time there was requirements that were being gathered. After that was done, implementation was done. Once all the implementation was done, then testing and so on. Throughout the world, these issues were getting very common. So even before Agile come into picture, there was something that they thought about in which rather than working on gathering all the requirement for complete project, what if we split up the requirement? And that is exactly what we do in Agile as well. We have this big chunk of requirement which was taking, let's say 4 weeks. So rather than that, they will break down into 4 individual chunks which will take about a week each for the requirements. Now since we are breaking things down, implementing one piece of requirement could start in parallel while the requirement team is gathering the other 3 requirements. And that is what we do in Agile methodology. Now, rather than gathering all the requirements together, we have broken that down into 4 individual pieces. So as soon as the first one is done, we can start the implementation on that while the requirement team works on the second part. And once the second requirements are done, they can start implementing that, and so on. Same applies for testing and deployment. The main advantage here is we are not waiting for a long time for the requirements to be done. We are splitting that up in short pieces. That's why it will be completed much faster. And if you think about this, the first deployment is done right here. While if it was a waterfall, that deployment will be done at the very end right here. So what happens is if once the code is deployed, there are some feedback, requirement team can start right away while the implementation is working on the other changes. If this was a waterfall, they would have to wait till the end here since the code will be deployed right here, and then they will start requirements at this particular time, which will take much longer, and that ultimately delays the project. So you can see how splitting up in shorter chunks here helps in accomplishing the project much better. Now, while we are splitting the task here, we divide the complete time into multiple sprints. Like let's say in sprint 1, we will work on 2 requirements, and we anticipate the requirement 1 to be done in 1 week. So after that, the implementation can start right away in sprint 1. Then we will have sprint 2, in which we will have multiple other pieces, sprint 3, sprint 4, and so on. Agile and sprint in software development are typically a cycle, so it goes on and on. So after all of this, there will be new requirements, new implementation, and so on. We just divide everything into smaller chunks. That way we can tackle that and we can deploy some code in every sprint rather than deploying the complete code altogether. So with that brief overview, let me walk you through some more details about a sprint. Sprints are meant for short duration. Now this duration can be 1 week all the way up to 4 weeks. But most common duration for sprint is 2 weeks. This gives developer enough time to release some of the improvements or new tasks. If the time is too short for a sprint, that means very little work will be done in a sprint, and if the time is too long, like over 4 weeks or even 4 weeks, that means that the business will have to wait for a long time before new changes are released. Sprints are boxed time period. Based on the short duration, you can easily define the start and end date for a sprint. Because you know that sprint is of a specific interval, that means that a sprint will start at a definite time and it will end in, let's say, 2 weeks. Another thing to remember is sprint has a predefined goal or capacity. What I mean by this is before the sprint starts, it is typically defined on what are the tasks that will be completed in a sprint. Now, when we define that X amount of tasks will be completed in a sprint, it does not mean that it cannot take longer for a certain task. In real world, it is common that some items go over the expected time and they do not finish in a sprint. In that case, we just move it on to the next sprint and continue. Sprint is not one and done. It is a cycle that continues in software development. Now, when it comes to a sprint, there are few things that happens and helps in a software development cycle. The first step is sprint planning, during which we define what are the goals we want to achieve in the sprint. When we work with any software development, there is typically a product owner. Product owner views all the backlogs, or basically a list of all the items that we need to do on the software. And they will decide that which of them are high priority, and based on that, those user stories are moved to sprint backlog. Sprint backlog basically means a list of all the items that will be completed in a sprint. So for every sprint, when we plan a sprint beforehand, we have a defined user stories or task that will be completed in a sprint. Then we have daily scrums. During the sprint, let's say our sprint is of 2 weeks. So every day we will have a daily scrum meeting. Scrum meetings are typically very short. Every developer has a couple of minutes to speak during the scrum meeting. They will discuss what was the work that was done yesterday, what work will be done today, and are there any roadblocks that needs to be cleared. That's it. We do not have any technical discussion in the Scrum meeting. The goal is to keep these meetings as short as possible. So that is the daily thing that happens with Scrum. Now when the sprint ends, let's say in 2 weeks, there is something called a sprint review that is done. At that point, we will review the work that was done in the sprint. And finally, this is not the step that every development team does, but there is something called a sprint retrospection. In that, they basically discuss on what can be improved in the sprint and are there anything that could have been done better. Like I said before, sprint is a cycle and it continues. So there is sprint 1, after 2 weeks it will be sprint 2, sprint 3, sprint 4, and on and on. The goal of a sprint is that in 2 weeks, we have the X amount of work that we want to develop and deliver. That way, business does not have to wait for a long time before some change is pushed on the website, and it is continuous development. Now let me walk you through a typical scenario. There is a product backlog. Like I said before, that typically there is a product owner, and there will be business who will have multiple requirements or new feature they want in a product. So right now, let's say we have 8 items in our product backlog that the business wants. The product owner will review the product backlog and then they decide which of the product backlog items are high priority. So let's say they decide the top 5 here are high priority and they want to accomplish that in sprint 1. That individual story will be divided into workable tasks. Those tasks will be assigned to developer. I am not going into much details right now, but I want to give you a 10,000 feet overview. So basically, product owner decides that the top 5 are high priority, and that's what we want to complete in sprint 1. Now that is what the product owner has decided. But the product owner does not know that is it possible to complete all 5 of the story within the given amount of time that we have in a sprint, which is 2 weeks in our example. So then what happens is product owner will sit down with the development team and they will review the user story for sprint 1. Let's say development team says that this is too much for 2 weeks and it cannot be accomplished. We need to move one story back. So they move one of the story back to the product backlog and then they finalize sprint 1 has these 4 stories. That looks good. Similarly for sprint 2, the remaining 4, they will add that on sprint 2 and review it again with the development team. They think that looks okay, and with that the goal or the task for sprints are decided. And this is basically goal for the given sprint. Same goes for the next sprint and the cycle continues. But this is basically how sprint goals are defined. Now once the goal is set, it is not set in stone. If there are business needs, goals can of course be toggled in a sprint if something high priority comes into picture, and that is completely okay. The main goal of a sprint is to have a predefined task with the flexibility to change if business requirements change in middle of the sprint. So basically, if a new story gets added to the sprint backlog, then it is very well possible that one of the existing story will have to be moved out from the sprint backlog to product backlog. And that is a very common scenario. So that accomplishes the first step, which is setting the sprint goal. So with that sprint planning set in place, when the date arrives, the sprint starts, and with that there is the daily meeting that also happens, which is Scrum meetings. These are the daily meetings which are meant mostly for the development team and the product team. If there are some technical questions, they should be kept out of these meetings and taken offline, since it would be a waste of time to go in technical discussion with everyone on the call. So I hope that gives you a brief idea of what a sprint is and how it is helpful in software development.